It was supposed to be just a peaceful weekend getaway at the farm, a simple escape from the hustle of daily life. But little did I know. Amidst the serene countryside and glasses of wine, a shocking secret was about to unravel. A single glance. An unshakable feeling. A forbidden connection, all spiraling into a moment that tested the very foundation of my marriage. Join me as I take you through a gripping tale of loyalty, betrayal, and the choices that can change everything. Thank you for taking the time to watch this story. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more compelling and meaningful stories. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to share more unique narratives. It was meant to be just a simple weekend escape, a brief respite from the grind of daily life. A chance to breathe in the fresh country air and reconnect. My husband, Henry, and I had been married for 5 steady years. Our life, though not particularly thrilling, was comfortable. Henry had a stable job. We owned a cozy home. And our days followed a predictable rhythm. For all intents and purposes, we were content. The invitation came unexpectedly. Daniel, Henry's best friend, called one evening out of the blue. He'd been part of Henry's life since their high school days. A constant presence in our shared history. Daniel wasn't just another friend, he was the kind of person who'd show up when you needed him most. The one you'd trust with just about anything. His voice over the phone carried the same easygoing warmth as always. As he extended an invitation to spend the weekend at his farm. "Come out here and relax," Daniel urged. His tone light but somehow insistent. "The farm's too quiet with Amy and the kids gone for the weekend. It'll be nice to catch up." At first, I didn't think much of it. The idea seemed harmless. Almost charming, a weekend getaway with an old friend. But something about the way Daniel emphasized the emptiness of his home. The way he lingered on the idea of the 3 of us alone, stirred a faint unease in me. I brushed it off as overthinking. Surely, it was nothing. Henry, on the other hand, was enthusiastic. "It'll be fun," he said. His smile widening at the thought of leaving behind the city and its endless demands. Daniel's always good company. And it's been ages since we've had a proper break. His excitement was contagious. And I found myself agreeing. Despite the faint flicker of hesitation that remained at the back of my mind. By the time Saturday morning arrived, we were packed and ready. The drive out to the farm was idyllic, rolling hills, golden fields, and the occasional cluster of trees lining the road. As we approached, the sight of Daniel standing by the driveway, waving with his signature grin, felt oddly reassuring. He welcomed us with his usual firm handshake and a warm laugh, immediately easing any lingering doubts. The farmhouse was like something out of a rustic dream. The creak of the wooden floors underfoot, the towering stone fireplace anchoring the living room, and the carefully curated blend of antique furniture and rustic decor, it all exuded a sense of home. Of simplicity. Daniel had poured his heart into this place. And it showed. Lunch was a lively affair. Daniel, ever the charming host, kept the conversation flowing with ease. We reminisced about old times, laughed at shared memories, and spoke of the little joys and challenges life had brought since we'd last gathered. Everything about the afternoon felt ordinary, comforting. Even. And yet, a strange undercurrent lingered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. After lunch, Daniel suggested we tour the property. Henry, surprisingly, expressed more interest in exploring the barn than the fields or woods. His newfound curiosity struck me as odd. But I brushed it off and followed Daniel outside. The air was crisp. And the scenery was breathtaking, endless fields dotted with wildflowers. The occasional low moo of cattle in the distance. And the sun casting a golden hue over everything. Daniel led the way, pointing out recent additions to the farm, a new fence, a small chicken coop, a couple of animals he'd acquired. His voice was steady and familiar. But I found myself growing more aware of the quiet around us. It wasn't just peaceful, it felt weighted. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the beauty of the farm. As we approached the edge of the woods, Daniel slowed, stopping beside a weathered bench overlooking the property. He gestured for me to sit, but I chose to stand, taking in the view. The farm stretched endlessly before us, a patchwork of green and gold under the afternoon sun. It should have felt tranquil. Instead, it felt heavy, as though the stillness held secrets. Daniel's voice broke the silence. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his tone softer than before. When I turned to respond, I caught his gaze, steady, searching, and somehow different. It wasn't the familiar look of a trusted friend. There was something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. The realization crept in slowly, like a fog rolling over the fields. I was suddenly aware of the space between us, or rather, the lack of it. His presence felt too close, too intense. My heart quickened as the unease I'd pushed aside all weekend surged to the forefront. The world around us remained still, but the air between Daniel and me crackled with something unspoken, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. In that moment, everything shifted, and the weekend away, meant to be simple and carefree, took on an edge I couldn't ignore. I stepped back instinctively, but before I could retreat too far, he reached out and touched my arm, his fingers barely grazing my skin. It wasn't a forceful grip, just a gentle, deliberate connection. Yet it sent a ripple through me. For a brief, charged moment, time seemed to slow, and I could hear the faint echo of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken, yet undeniably intense. My gut churned, sending a warning. But my mind struggled to process. This wasn't a mere friendly gesture, it was more than that. Yet, I remained frozen, caught in the moment's gravity. Before I could find my voice or even think of pulling away, Henry's voice rang out from the barn in the distance, sharp and grounding like a sudden gust of wind on a foggy morning. The spell broke. Daniel quickly withdrew his hand, his movements abrupt but calculated, as if trying to erase what had just happened. For a fleeting second, we stood there, locked in an awkward silence that neither of us dared to fill. "Let's head back," he said finally, his tone painfully casual. But his eyes betrayed him. There was something different in them, something I couldn't quite name. I nodded numbly, my thoughts tangled. As we walked, the air between us felt heavier, loaded with questions I wasn't ready to ask and answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Whatever had just passed between us wasn't something that could be brushed off or ignored. It had a weight, a presence, and it was impossible to pretend otherwise. That evening, the dinner table became a sanctuary and a battlefield all at once. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth and the rich aroma of Daniel's homemade stew should have been comforting. But the tension from earlier clung to me like a second skin. I tried to bury it under polite conversation and the rhythm of shared laughter. But it was there, lurking beneath every word, every glance. Daniel was quieter than usual, though his eyes spoke volumes. I caught him looking at me more than once. Quick, almost furtive glances, as though he were studying me, trying to read the thoughts I refused to share. I focused on my plate, forcing down the food more as a distraction than a necessity. My smile felt brittle, a mask I wore to keep everything from unraveling. The weight of his gaze lingered, and though he never said a word, it was as if his presence alone demanded my attention. The conversation eventually drifted to lighter topics. And Henry, ever the optimist, suggested a glass of wine to unwind. "Come on," he said with a grin. "We don't get nights like this often. Let's enjoy it." I hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who gave a nonchalant shrug, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, anticipation. "Maybe." Reluctantly, I agreed. And soon the table was adorned with glasses of rich, ruby red wine. The first sip was soothing, and for a brief moment, I felt the edge of the evening soften. As the hours wore on, the wine flowed freely, and with it came a looseness to the air. Henry, ever the entertainer, launched into a story about work, his enthusiasm amplified by the alcohol. Meanwhile, Daniel grew more relaxed, but not in the same way. His charm took on an edge, his words laced with something that felt too intimate, too direct. He laughed easily, but his eyes always found mine, lingering just a heartbeat too long. It wasn't until later, when my own defenses began to waver, that I noticed how the distance between us had subtly closed. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and velvet-like as he spoke to me, though the words themselves were innocuous. The firelight cast shadows across his face, making his expressions unreadable. Then came the touch, a light brushing of his hand against mine, fleeting yet deliberate. My breath caught, and in that instant, the air around us seemed to crackle. Daniel's demeanor changed after that, his actions more confident, his words carrying an unspoken promise. I tried to convince myself it was the wine making me read too much into things. But the truth was glaringly obvious. I wasn't imagining this. The energy between us had shifted, and it was no longer subtle. By the time Henry left to grab more firewood, leaving Daniel and me alone in the living room, the tension felt unbearable. He leaned in closer, the faint scent of the wine on his breath mingling with the smoky warmth of the room. "You know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "you look beautiful tonight." My heart stumbled over itself, unsure whether to speed up or stop entirely. I managed a weak laugh, muttering something about the firelight playing tricks. But Daniel didn't smile. His gaze remained fixed on me, steady and unyielding. "I mean it," he said softly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made it impossible to dismiss. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, hoping the silence would swallow the moment whole. But Daniel pressed on, his words dipping into forbidden territory. "I've always thought you were beautiful," he admitted, his tone softer now, almost confessional. "But you've always been with Henry. I respect that. I do. It's just, sometimes, I wonder what it would be like if things were different." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. My pulse quickened, not with excitement but with the weight of implications I wasn't ready to face. Whatever had started as a subtle shift earlier had now erupted into something undeniable. Something that would be impossible to take back. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. And a wave of heat surged up my neck, spreading across my face like an uncontrollable fire. Was he really saying what I thought he was saying? Each word replayed in my mind, fragmented and heavy, as though they carried an unspoken weight that shifted the air around us. Was he genuinely implying something deeper? Something beyond the guise of a casual compliment? My thoughts spiraled, tangling into a web of confusion and unease. Before I could even attempt to form a coherent response, the door creaked open. Henry strode back into the room with an air of oblivious ease, scattering the fragile moment into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. Daniel straightened up almost immediately, his expression hardening into neutrality, as if flipping a switch. I followed suit, feigning a nonchalant demeanor. Though my heart was pounding like a frantic drumbeat, I could still feel the electricity lingering in the space between us. An invisible current that neither of us could extinguish. It was a silent acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. Something unspoken had cracked the surface, leaving a jagged fissure neither of us knew how to mend. Henry, oblivious to the tension thick enough to cut with a knife, sat down and launched into an enthusiastic monologue about a new project he was working on. His words filled the room, vibrant and detailed, but they passed through me like whispers in the wind. I nodded and offered faint smiles in all the right places. Yet my mind was stuck on an endless loop of Daniel's lingering gaze and the quiet, unsettling weight of his words. Every glance, every movement, replayed with vivid clarity, tugging at my thoughts like an anchor. My composure was fraying at the edges, but I was too tangled in the storm to fully understand what it meant. The next day, the uneasy knot in my stomach hadn't loosened. If anything, it had tightened, growing sharper with every passing hour. Sleep had eluded me, leaving my mind foggy and my nerves raw. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before, or rather, what hadn't happened but could have. I tried to convince myself that I had overanalyzed it, that Daniel's words were innocuous and my interpretation was the result of an overactive imagination. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize, the truth gnawed at me. Daniel had crossed a line, one that blurred the boundaries of what was acceptable. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. We spent the day outside, walking around the property under the guise of routine tasks. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the fields. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of earth and leaves. But even the idyllic setting couldn't quiet the turmoil churning inside me. I couldn't ignore the way Daniel's eyes followed me, lingering a moment too long, scrutinizing in a way that made my skin crawl. Every glance felt like a question, an unanswered proposition hovering between us. I tried to focus on the task at hand, collecting tools, taking inventory, planning the day's work, but my senses were on high alert, as if bracing for an inevitable confrontation. The tension reached a breaking point in the barn. It was a simple chore, helping Daniel sort tools while Henry worked on the tractor nearby. But as the minutes ticked by and Henry remained absorbed in his work, I found myself alone with Daniel in the dimly lit space. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of hay and motor oil, and my pulse quickened with each passing second. I knew I should walk away, put some distance between us. But my feet remained rooted to the ground. Daniel stepped closer. My senses sharpened, each sound amplified, the creak of his boots against the wooden floor, the soft exhale of his breath. He reached over me, his arm brushing against mine as he grabbed a tool from the shelf. His breath was warm against the back of my neck, and my entire body tensed, caught between instinct and hesitation. The moment stretched, thick and unyielding, as though time itself had paused to observe. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drumbeat that echoed in my ears. Every nerve in my body was alight, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us. There was no barn, no tools, no Henry, only the charged silence and the unspoken possibilities that hung between us. A dangerous thought crossed my mind. Unbidden but persistent, what if I let it happen? What if I turned around, closed the gap, and allowed the tension to dissolve into something undeniable? But then reality came crashing back, sharp and unforgiving. What was I thinking? My breath hitched, shallow and uneven, as I pulled away abruptly. The sudden movement felt jarring, as though I had broken some invisible tether. I should go check on Henry, I stammered, the words tumbling out in a shaky, barely audible rush. My voice betrayed me, cracking under the weight of my own conflicted emotions. Daniel didn't move. For a moment, he simply stood there, his expression unreadable. His eyes searched mine, as if trying to decipher the thoughts I was so desperately trying to hide. Finally, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His lips pressed into a thin line. The silence between us lingered, oppressive and unresolved. As I turned and walked away, my legs unsteady and my chest heavy with a mix of relief and regret. As I approached Henry, who was still engrossed in his work, I tried to steady my breathing, to push down the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume me. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't over. The line Daniel had crossed had left a mark, an indelible stain on the fragile balance of our lives. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, nothing would ever truly go back to the way it was. As I turned to walk away, an unshakable feeling settled in my chest, like I had narrowly escaped something immense. Something that had the potential to upend my entire existence. But deep down, I knew this was not the end. Not even close. Later that evening, after dinner, I found myself alone in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. The house was enveloped in an unsettling stillness. Henry had gone to bed early, retreating upstairs with a weariness I could sense but couldn't share. That left Daniel and me alone in the vast silence. A silence that felt heavier than it should have. I didn't want to be alone with him. Yet there I was, feeling as though I was drawn by some invisible force. Part of me knew I should leave, should retreat to my room, lock the door, and let the night pass without incident. But there was another part of me, a stubborn, reckless part, that needed answers. I needed to know if what had happened earlier in the barn was just an unfortunate accident or if it carried a weight I wasn't ready to face. Daniel entered the room quietly, his footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. He sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. His eyes, piercing and intense, locked onto mine with an unspoken gravity that made my pulse quicken. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my heart drop. I had known this moment was inevitable, yet no amount of preparation could have made me ready for it. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I don't want to make things weird between us, he began. His tone tentative yet sincere. But I need to be honest. I can't stop thinking about what happened in the barn earlier. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to hold my composure, forcing myself to meet his gaze despite the storm of emotions swirling within me. Daniel. We can't. I said, my voice trembling slightly. This isn't right. He shook his head, cutting me off before I could say more. I know it's not right, he admitted. His voice filled with frustration and something else, something raw and vulnerable. But that doesn't change the way I feel. I've always respected you. And I've never wanted to do anything that would hurt you or your marriage. But when I'm around you, it's like I can't help myself. There's something about you. Something I can't ignore. I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. His words were a confession, but they felt like a plea. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, searching for a way to diffuse the situation, to bring us both back to the reality we had no choice but to face. Daniel. We can't do this. I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's not just about me, it's about Henry too. I love him. And this would ruin everything. His gaze softened. And for a moment, he looked almost defeated. I don't want to ruin anything, he said quietly. I swear. But I need you to know that I care about you, more than just as a friend. The room felt unbearably small. The air too thick to breathe. I could feel my chest tightening, my thoughts spiraling. How had we gotten here? And more importantly, how was I supposed to walk away now? How could I unhear the words he had just spoken? Words that threatened to dismantle everything I thought I knew about my life. That night, after Daniel's confession, the world seemed to shift, tilting on an axis I couldn't find my balance on. Everything felt different. The walls of the house, the quiet hum of the heater, even the familiar scent of the firewood, they all seemed foreign. As though I had stepped into a life that wasn't my own. I barely slept. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying our conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every glance. And the worst part, I couldn't deny the truth buried in his words. I understood what he was saying, more than I wanted to admit. I had felt it too, that connection. That unspoken electricity that sparked whenever we were near each other. It wasn't new, though I had spent so long convincing myself it didn't exist. But it was there, undeniable and terrifying. Still, I had a husband. I had a life, a stable, predictable life that I wasn't ready to throw away for what might only be a fleeting moment of passion. Or maybe it wasn't just passion. Maybe it was something deeper. Something I was too afraid to name. The idea scared me more than anything else. As much as I wanted to tell Daniel to leave, to walk away and never bring it up again, I couldn't. There was something in his eyes. Something raw and earnest. That made me hesitate. If I pushed him away too harshly, would I be closing the door on something irreplaceable? Would I be making a mistake I'd regret for the rest of my life? It was a dangerous line to walk. And I knew it. But in the quiet hours of the night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder where that line even was. Was it already too late? Had I crossed it without realizing? The questions lingered, unanswered and unrelenting, as the fire burned low and the night stretched on. Somewhere in the distance, the clock chimed, marking the passing of time that felt heavier than it should. And I, caught between two worlds, could do nothing but wait for the dawn, hoping it might bring clarity, or at least the strength to face whatever came next. The next day, the tension in the air was nearly unbearable. Thick and stifling like a summer storm on the verge of breaking. Every glance at Daniel sent a wave of unease crashing through me. A nauseating churn that left me breathless. And every time I looked at Henry, my heart clenched with guilt. As though my silence alone was an act of betrayal. I was caught in a relentless tug-of-war between my loyalty to the man I'd promised to love forever and the undeniable pull I felt toward Daniel, a pull I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't entirely resist. Outside, the day unfolded like any other. Henry and Daniel were working on the fence, their laughter echoing through the open space. An easy camaraderie that should have made me smile but instead felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Meanwhile, I busied myself around the barn. Though I barely registered what I was doing. My hands moved mechanically, tidying up tools and sweeping hay, while my mind was consumed by the chaos I felt. I was suffocating, caught between their voices, their presence, and the secret that weighed heavier with each passing moment. I wanted to scream, to shatter the illusion of normalcy. I wanted to tell Daniel that this couldn't happen, that whatever was brewing between us had to stop. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I'd already crossed an invisible line, one I couldn't step back from. As the sun climbed higher, so did the intensity of Daniel's actions. They were subtle, but to me, they felt loud and deliberate. When he passed by, his hand would graze mine ever so briefly. Or he'd lean in just a fraction too close. His voice low and suggestive as he commented on how I looked that day. Each word, each touch, felt like a match striking against dry wood. Was he testing me? Seeing how far he could go before I broke? Or was he waiting for me to make the next move? To validate whatever it was he felt. I tried to ignore him, to brush off his advances like dust on my sleeve. But it wasn't that simple. Every touch lingered in my mind. Every word echoed long after it was spoken. By lunchtime, the tension had reached a breaking point. We sat beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, the shade offering respite from the heat but doing nothing to cool the fire burning inside me. Henry was talking animatedly about a project at work, his voice filled with enthusiasm. I wanted to focus on him, to absorb every word like I used to. But my mind was elsewhere, on Daniel, sitting so close that his leg brushed against mine under the table. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. The food on my plate turned to ash in my mouth, and I struggled to appear normal, to swallow, to breathe. The air was oppressive, and I felt like I was choking on everything unsaid. Daniel broke the silence, his voice cutting through Henry's laughter like a blade. "You're awfully quiet today," he said, his gaze locking onto mine with that same intensity that both thrilled and terrified me. I forced a smile, the corners of my mouth trembling under the weight of the emotions swirling within me. "I'm fine," I replied. But the words felt hollow, a weak attempt to mask the turmoil. Even I could hear the strain in my voice. And I knew Daniel could too. His knowing smile told me as much. Henry's laughter faded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned to me. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine concern. "Just tired," I lied, my words tumbling out too quickly. I couldn't look at Henry, not without feeling like a fraud, but I couldn't look at Daniel either. I was trapped. the space between them shrinking with each passing second, threatening to consume me entirely. And Daniel's eyes, flicking between Henry and me, held a gleam that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if he saw through me, as if he knew the storm brewing within me better than I did. His smirk felt like a secret, one I wasn't privy to but was somehow a part of. In that moment, I felt exposed, laid bare for him to see, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. By evening, the exhaustion had settled into my bones. The day had drained me of everything: my energy, my resolve, my sanity. I retreated to bed early, desperate for an escape. The sheets felt cool against my skin, but my mind was anything but calm. Sleep evaded me as I replayed every moment, every glance, every touch. I told myself that by morning, this would all feel different, that the clarity I so desperately needed would come with the dawn. But as the hours ticked by, my restlessness only grew. Sometime after midnight, just as I felt myself beginning to drift, a soft knock pulled me from the edge of sleep. My heart jumped, the sound cutting through the quiet like a sharp intake of breath. I glanced at the clock, the glowing numbers telling me it was well past midnight. Panic gripped me as the door creaked open, revealing Daniel standing there, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. His face was a mix of hesitation and determination, his eyes searching mine as if he were looking for permission. My stomach twisted into knots, my pulse quickening as the reality of the moment sank in. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice low and raw, barely more than a breath. "But I can't stop thinking about you." And just like that, the fragile world I'd been holding together began to crumble around me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. My breath caught in my throat like a net ensnaring an unwelcome realization. What was happening? Was this really happening? My mind raced as I tried to process the reality before me. Daniel, my friend, my confidant, my safe space, was standing in my room. His presence unsettlingly intimate, his words laced with a vulnerability that seemed both foreign and magnetic. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice soft yet insistent, taking a hesitant step closer as if testing the fragile boundaries between us. "But I need to know if you feel the same way I do, because if you do, I can't just keep pretending like nothing's happening. I can't keep pretending that this doesn't exist." His words hung in the air like the echo of a thunderclap, reverberating in my chest, shaking loose feelings I had buried so deep I hadn't realized they were there. My heart thudded painfully, each beat an aching contradiction. I sat up slowly, gripping the edge of the bed as though it could anchor me amidst the storm brewing inside. My mind was a battleground, torn between two opposing forces. One part of me screamed at him to leave, to stop, to preserve the fragile life I had built with Henry, a life that felt solid, dependable, safe. But another part, a quieter yet no less insistent part, urged me to let go, to lean into the magnetic pull I felt towards Daniel, to discover where this unfamiliar and dangerous connection might lead. Before I could utter a word, before I could summon the courage to push him away, or pull him closer, Daniel closed the distance between us. His hand, trembling slightly, reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek with a tenderness that made my breath hitch. I couldn't move. His closeness was intoxicating, overwhelming. The warmth radiating from him seemed to seep into my skin, melting the walls I had so carefully constructed. In that moment, All I could think about was how much I wanted to kiss him. How much I wanted to lose myself in whatever this was, just for a moment. But then, like the cruel jolt of an alarm clock shattering a perfect dream, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the room. My stomach dropped as reality came crashing back down. It was Henry. Daniel immediately stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment, the intensity of the moment dissipating as quickly as it had ignited. I shot to my feet, panic surging through me. My mind was racing, scrambling to piece together an explanation, a way to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't happening, this couldn't happen. I rushed to the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle, and swung it open just as Henry rounded the corner. He stopped, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern as his eyes darted between me and Daniel, who now stood awkwardly near the bed, his posture stiff with guilt. "Everything okay?" Henry asked, his tone calm but tinged with an edge of suspicion. His gaze lingered on Daniel, then shifted back to me, silently asking the questions he didn't yet dare voice. The weight of his trust pressed down on me like a physical burden. And for a moment, I couldn't find the words to respond. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm chaotic and unforgiving. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I justify the fact that I had allowed Daniel to get so close? That I had been swept away by something I didn't fully understand? "Henry." I began, my voice faltering. But before I could say more, Henry raised a hand, cutting me off. "It's fine," he said softly, his tone calm but distant, as if he were standing on the other side of a chasm that had just opened between us. "I'm just going to get some water. I'll be right back." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, each step twisting the knife of guilt deeper into my chest. Relief and dread warred within me, the former fleeting and the latter all-consuming. The storm that had been building inside me now raged unchecked. What had I done? Why had I let it get this far? And most importantly, how could I face Henry after this? I turned slowly to Daniel, who stood frozen, his eyes wide and full of regret. His expression was unreadable, a swirling mix of emotions that mirrored my own turmoil. "You should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Each word felt heavy, laden with finality. This isn't right. You can't be here." Daniel nodded, his face contorted with frustration and remorse. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't have done that. I thought maybe you felt it too. I thought maybe there was something real between us." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he was wrong, that nothing had changed, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. And as Daniel left the room, closing the door softly behind him, I realized that the fragile balance of my world had been irrevocably shattered. Nothing would ever be the same again. "I don't know what I feel," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, shaking my head in despair. "But I know that I can't do this. I can't hurt Henry. I can't hurt our marriage. It's not worth it. It never was." Daniel's eyes lingered on mine for a moment that felt like an eternity. His silence was heavy, a mixture of regret and resignation. Without saying a word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. leaving me standing there amidst the ruins of my own emotions. I closed the door with trembling hands and collapsed onto the bed, my head sinking into my hands as the weight of everything bore down on me. How did it come to this? One moment, life felt familiar and certain. And the next, I was drowning in a sea of guilt, confusion, and self-reproach. My mind replayed the events of the evening in a relentless loop. How had I let myself get so close to the edge of something so destructive? Why had I allowed my judgment to falter? Even for a second, the sound of Henry's footsteps broke through my haze. They were deliberate, steady, yet laced with an urgency that made my heart race. He was coming. I wiped my eyes hurriedly, as if erasing the evidence of my turmoil could somehow undo the truth. But deep down, I knew better. This was not something I could hide. Not from him. Not anymore. A soft knock came at the door before it creaked open. Henry stood in the doorway, his eyes searching mine. They were soft, concerned even. But there was an undercurrent of unease, as though he could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice gentle but uncertain. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I felt like I needed to check on you." I rose from the bed, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The words I needed to say clawed at my throat, but the weight of them made it hard to breathe. "Henry," I began, my voice trembling. "I need to talk to you. There's something you need to know. Something that happened with Daniel." His brows furrowed, his expression shifting from concern to confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, stepping further into the room. I took a shaky breath, feeling the ground beneath me crumble with each passing second. "I don't know how to explain this," I said, my voice breaking. "But I almost crossed a line with Daniel tonight. He came into my room, and I didn't stop him. I didn't tell him to leave. And I don't even know why. I wasn't thinking. But I'm sorry. Henry. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating and inescapable. Henry's face paled as he processed what I had just confessed. The pain in his eyes was visceral, cutting deeper than any raised voice or angry outburst ever could. But he didn't shout. He didn't lash out. Instead, he stood there, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. "You almost crossed a line," he repeated, his voice measured but tight, each word weighted with disbelief. "What does that mean?" "Exactly. You mean you too?" I shook my head violently, tears spilling over despite my efforts to hold them back. "No. Henry. Nothing happened. Nothing physical. But he said things that made me question everything. And I let it go too far. I let him get too close. I'm so sorry. I should have stopped him. I should have stopped it before it even began." Henry's arms crossed over his chest as he looked away, his gaze distant and unfocused. The silence between us stretched unbearably, the unspoken words building a wall that seemed insurmountable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried an edge that sliced through me. "I can't believe this," he murmured, almost to himself. "I trusted you. I trusted him. And this is what I get." "Henry. Please." I begged, my voice cracking. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I love you. You have to believe me." But even as I spoke, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The unshakable trust we had built over the years was gone, crumbling under the weight of my actions, or rather, my inaction. No matter how many times I apologized, I couldn't undo what had almost happened. Henry walked to the door, his back to me. His posture was stiff, his shoulders tense. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe, before speaking without turning around. "I don't know if I can look at you the same way after this. I need time." "We both do." His voice was steady, but the hurt beneath it was undeniable. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, the enormity of what I had just lost sinking in. My heart felt heavy, weighted with the guilt and regret of 1,000 unspoken truths. In a single night, I had undone so much of what we had built together. And now, all I had left was the hollow echo of my own mistakes, reverberating in the empty room. I sank to the floor, the tears coming harder now, unchecked and unstoppable. The damage was done. And no matter how deeply I loved him, no matter how earnestly I wished I could turn back time, the truth remained: I had betrayed him. And I didn't know how, or if, I could ever make things right again. In the end, I chose to face the truth and accept the consequences of my moment of weakness. Everything between Henry, Daniel, and me had changed irrevocably. My marriage was in turmoil. But through it, I learned a crucial lesson: honesty and trust are the foundation of any relationship. I had to forgive myself and start anew, even though the road ahead seemed daunting. This story taught me one thing: when you let emotions take control, you not only risk losing others but also yourself. Life is a series of choices, and sometimes a single decision can alter everything. If something feels wrong, trust your instincts and walk away before it's too late. Clear boundaries are essential to protect your relationships and self-respect. Forgiveness is not just for others but also for yourself, allowing you to move forward. Never trade the peace of a long-term relationship for a fleeting moment of temptation. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this emotional story. If you found it meaningful, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Your support is the inspiration that keeps us sharing more profound and impactful stories.